So I think we will get started. I noticed that I wrote the wrong time in the post yesterday. I think I wrote 6 o'clock, while it is actually 4 o'clock. And I think that means some of the ones who have registered are probably going to connect themselves a little bit late and have to watch the recording. I'm sorry for my mistake. The topic of today is training, the basic tracking. So that means with which technique we want the dog to track, how we want the dog to negotiate turns and surface transitions. So that will be the main bulk of this, but we will cover some other parts of the tracking as well, which are needed for tracking dog teams to be able to do real tracks a little bit later on. And with real tracks, I mean tracks that are laid by someone else who is actually trying actively to get away from you. We will do 2 breaks. So I will talk for about 40 minutes now, and then we have a break. And if you have questions, please write them in the chat, and we will go through them one by one at the end of this webinar. And the recording is available for 2 weeks here on Click Meeting. And a little bit later tonight, you will get the link to the recording sent out to you. It takes some time for the recording to get published on Click Meeting's webpage, and then I will send it to you. Then we start. And the first slide I would like to show you, which is very important, is this. Because sometimes in tracking dog training, you can hear instructors or colleagues of tracking dog handlers saying that you need to trust the dog. Excuse me. You can hear instructors or colleagues of the dog handler saying that you need to trust the dog. And that is true, but it is also the last thing that you should do. Because dogs are not born knowing how you want them to track, or what you want them to track, or when you want them to track. That is something you have to train them to do. And then you need to test to make sure that your training has had the desired result and the dog actually can perform what you want it to do. Then you can trust the dog. But first train, then test, and then trust. Dogs can for sure follow tracks from birth, but that does not mean they will follow the tracks you want them to follow and in the manner that you want them to follow tracks, or when you want them to follow tracks. So this requires quite a lot of training, and tracking is, in my opinion, the most fun thing that we train dogs to do. But it is also maybe the most difficult thing that we train dogs to do. It takes a lot of training to get this working reliably. Here is an overview of a progression plan for basic tracking. And of course, as all other training, it requires that you have a dog that is possible to motivate with something, preferably with toys and playing, but if nothing else, at least with food. And as you can see, at the base is indication on articles. And the reason for why we build our tracking training on indication on articles is that we want to be able to backchain the tracking without having the dog handler having to point or guide the dog too much, because then we risk creating expectations that we later on want to remove. And when we backchain the tracking from the indication of articles, this is something that most dogs need to learn anyways. Most tracking dogs are expected to indicate articles in the track, so we don't lose any time by teaching this from the start. It's a skill the dog has to learn anyways. And third, it makes it much easier for the dog handler to deliver the reward with a good timing and with a good placement, because in both detection and tracking we want the dog to have no expectation whatsoever on the handler. The expectation should be away from the handler and in the track. And this is much easier if we use articles that the dog indicates. And I will first show you an example of what I mean and what we are talking about today when we say tracking, because there are some different techniques that can be used for tracking, or what is sometimes called trailing dogs. And what we're talking about tonight is what is called tracking dogs. And that is dogs that mainly follow the scent on the ground, and that we in the training want to stay as close to the actual track as possible. So in a track like this, there is probably more scent in the grass on the side of the pedestrian asphalt path here than it is on the actual asphalt. But for tracking dogs, we want them to have the highest expectation on the actual track where a person or an animal has been walking. So it is preferable that the dog is rewarded for this over being rewarded for searching the airborne scent that is also there. But in my experience, it takes a longer time for the dog that follows the airborne scent to actually catch up with a person than if we have a dog that follows the scent on the ground. So if it is important to have the chance to catch up with a person or an animal, it is usually preferable to have the dog trained to follow the ground-borne scent, because it will make the dog lose the track less often and having to recover the track less often, which saves a lot of time. Here is an example of a dog handler whose dog has managed a difficulty in the track. It's a stuffed Dalmatian dog that is standing in the track facing the direction that the dog was coming from. And most dogs think that this is a real dog standing there and react accordingly. They stop, they sniff it in the behinds, and then when the Dalmatian falls over, they discover that this is not a real dog. And then his dog picks up the track on the other side of the Dalmatian, and he wants to reinforce the dog for that. And then he reinforces with the foot of a deer, and that's a quite big reinforcement. And he wants to deliver the reinforcement in front of the dog and in the track. We can have a look at how that turns out. So unfortunately he is hitting the dog in the hindquarters, and it doesn't hurt the dog much. But it's not the placement of the reward that he desired. So instead, we can make it a bit easier if we backchain the tracking from articles in the track. Here the dog finds the article in the track, it indicates, and then the dog handler doesn't need to have any good timing. He has all the time in the world to get the reward, click, and give the dog the ball. So this is one of the benefits with backchaining the tracking. It makes it much easier to deliver the reward with a good precision and a good timing, which may otherwise be quite tricky. And what often happens is when you walk with a dog tracking and you think that now he's tracking really good, I want to reinforce this. Then you let go of one hand to take out the toy, and often then there is a little bit slack in the line, and the dog looks back towards you and is rewarded for looking back at you, because that is when you throw the reward. So first we teach the dog the indication, and then we start backchaining the track from the indication. And we have had other webinars on how to train indication, so I will not waste any time on that here and now. So when we have taught the dog to indicate articles, we try to make the dog understand or expect to find articles in the contaminated area that is actually a track or a series of footsteps from a human. And we then start with a 1 meter scent box, you may call it. So the track layer, which in this early in the tracking training, it is most often the dog handler, him or herself, who just walks 1 meter forward and then back in the same meter. So this is not a track, it's just footsteps pointing both forward and backward. And in this contaminated area, which will be contaminated both with the footsteps and small pieces of skin and hair from the person, we also place 3 small articles. Coins or washers, the metallic rings you put around screws, for example. And then we let the dog search for these small articles and find them and get rewarded. And it usually doesn't take long before the dog sees the correlation that for some reason these small articles are found in this contaminated area. And since dogs are about as lazy as we are, they then try to locate this contaminated area and then the articles, because the contaminated area smells more than the small articles. And that's exactly what we want. We want the dog to have the expectation that if it just stays in the contaminated area, it will find the articles. And the smaller the articles are, or the less they smell, the quicker will it be for the dog to make this association. If you have big Kong pieces or big coins that smell a lot, it will be overshadowing the scent from the contaminated box. This process also is quicker if the area outside of the box is relatively clean. So the optimal area is an IKEA parking lot Sunday morning before a lot of cars has started to come there, because then it will be a big contrast between the scented area or the contaminated box that we are doing and outside the contaminated box, because there will be no footsteps and no articles found. But in the contaminated area there will be footsteps and the articles will be found there. We start with a 1 meter box or 1 meter area because we want the dog to have high expectation to find the articles when it starts sniffing. We don't want dogs start sniffing and then finding the articles always several meters away, because then they will have less expectation in the start of the track, because they know that articles are always further down the line. And this will gradually be what you call it, a slippery slope, because if the dog has lower expectations to find the article in the beginning of the track, it will also start finding fewer articles in the beginning of the track, and it will be increasing. And the start of the track is extremely important. So we need the dog to have a high expectation to switch on the nose and sniff with a high frequency already from the first step in the track. We start off doing these exercises on asphalt. And the reason for that is that it's a little bit easier for the dog to connect the smell of the actual person that has been walking there with the articles, compared to if we start this on grass, then it is more likely that the dog associates the scent of crushed vegetation, killed insects, and disturbed soil with finding the articles. And the problem with that is that then we have a higher risk of the dog switching over to tracks from other persons or animals later on, because they will also smell from crushed vegetation, disturbed soil, and dead or crushed insects. But if we from the start give the dog a chance to associate the scent of the track layer with finding the articles, we make it less likely that the dog gets problems later on with switching to other persons or animals. And we also make it easier for the dog to follow tracks also on hard surfaces later on. And when the dog can do 1 meter, 2 meter, and 4 meter long boxes with 3 articles on asphalt, we repeat the same on gravel and then on grass. And when starting these exercises with the boxes on asphalt and gravel and grass, it's beneficial if we can keep the intensity high. So don't wait for a full indication. Reward the dog just for reacting to the scent. Otherwise, the dog may think that it's the sitting that is more important than the finding. It's easy to get a nice and reliable sit later on, but here we want to have a high intensity and the dog associating finding the articles with the contaminated area. When the dog has done the boxes 1, 2, and 4 meters, we make a triangle. And the reason for this is that we want to trick the dog to start following the track. So then there will be no articles in the triangle, just a lot of footsteps. And the dog is searching for the articles in the contaminated area and just continues with the contaminated area that is actually a track. And then all of a sudden there are articles there that the dog can indicate and get rewarded. When you do these initial trainings where you have the contaminated boxes, try to keep the training sessions short and clean. And with clean, I mean that when the dog is doing this exercise, you also try to focus on this. So the dog is either searching and indicating, or it is rewarded. So try to avoid standing and talking to someone else while the dog is waiting to do the next session. It is easier for the dog to learn what we want it to learn if during these initial sessions the training session is not clouded with a lot of other noise from other activities. So try to have a session where the dog is either searching, indicating, or is rewarded. Nothing else. I can try to show you with a video clip what I mean. So here the dog is searching a contaminated area where there are 3 small articles. And here I try to have the dog either searching, indicating, or rewarded. And here to start with, the dog is searching outside of the contaminated area. And if you're impatient, it may be easy here to point with your hand and show the dog that, hey, the contaminated area is here. But then the dog doesn't get the chance to learn what we want it to learn. So please let the dog search outside the contaminated area, because there are no footsteps there and it will not find any articles. So we want to give the dog a chance to learn the contrast between the contaminated area and all the other areas. If you as a dog handler stop the dog, recall the dog, or point the dog, your interaction will overshadow the dog's own searching, and the dog will be rewarded for following your directions, not for actually sniffing intense and trying to find the contaminated area. So just let the dog work. And then once the session is over, when the dog has found all 3 articles, then we can talk to the dog or to others. But try to keep the actual training and time in between repetitions clean. So you don't let the dog do a lot of other things, because we risk that they also become reinforced as parts of a chain of behaviors. The dog doesn't really know when one chain of behavior starts and another one stops. So we make it easier for the dog by keeping the sessions short and clean from other things. So then we have a dog that has seen the light when it comes to associating contaminated areas with finding articles. And the articles mean that the dog had a chance to be reinforced. So then we start to add a track instead of a contaminated area, and we place the articles in the track. The first times it's important to use many articles because we want to be quite sure that the dog will get reinforced for following the track. So, for example, in this video, there is a short track that may be 20 meters long or something like that. And I don't remember exactly, but I suspect that I may have somewhere between 5 and 10 articles in this short track. The dog is tracking off leash, and I know that the dog will probably run over 1, 2, or 3 articles, but I want to be fairly sure that he finds at least 1 or 2. So somewhere between 5 and 10 articles. If the dog walks over 1 or more, it doesn't matter. It just has to suit itself. The dog misses an opportunity to be rewarded. And when the dog has found the first article, I start from there, cue the dog to track, and then stand still. And this is one of the critical parts of the tracking dog training, because we want the expectation to find articles in the track be what pulls the dog forward in the track. We don't want it to be the handler who is pushing or keeping the dog in the track. So it really pays off to do this kind of training where the dog is off leash to start with. Because if the dog is just running around, it will find very few articles and have very few rewards, compared to if it actually tries to stay in the contaminated area and find the small articles and be rewarded for it. So we want the dog to understand that the quickest way to get to the articles and the possibility to be reinforced is to stay in the contaminated area that is the track. So now we have a dog that has a high expectation to find articles in the contaminated area that is the track. And if you have gotten this far, then you have done far more than 50% of the tracking dog training. Because if we have a dog that has a high expectation to stick to the contaminated area that is the track, then that is the most important part of the tracking dog training. So it's perfectly fine if this part of the training takes some weeks to accomplish. Don't panic if it takes maybe 3 or 4 weeks to get the dog to be able to follow a 20-meter long track off leash and indicate most articles there. And what we do then is that we extend the track until the dog can follow tracks that are at least 50 meters long with some turns when they are off leash. And we do that before we start to put the tracking line on the dog and restrict and communicate with the dog, because everything we do as handlers has a tendency to be interpreted as more important by the dogs, and thus it's easy that what we do becomes associated with a reward rather than following the track and finding the articles.
Bravo! Let's go. Spåra. Weissman, kom. Sitt. Spåra.
Here the track goes in the middle of the road. So you can see the dog drifts off a bit and then comes back in and picks up the track. And here once again, as a handler, I do not go in and help the dog. It's his loss if he misses 1 or 2 articles and misses the opportunity to be reinforced. And as a rule of thumb, I use that when the dog can do a 50-meter long track like this and find and indicate at least 4 out of 5 articles, then it is time to start hooking the line to the dog and introduce that in the track. And we'll talk more about that when we are back after the break. So we can meet back here again at 10 minutes to 5. That's 10 minutes from now. Okay. we start again. I hope you had time to get up and moving so you're not sitting and falling asleep. So then we have a dog that one has the skill to indicate articles the way we want it to, and to expect to find these articles in the scented surfaces on the ground. And as I finished off by saying, when the dog can do a 50-meter long track off leash and find and indicate 4 out of 5 articles, if it can do that once, it's perfectly fine to move on to the next step. And the next step is to start adding the line and teach the dog with which technique we want it to follow the tracks. And it doesn't matter if we prefer using a harness or if we have the line attached to the dog's collar and under one of the front legs, which is a common procedure. That does not matter. But what we need now is to decide how do we want the dog to track. And in my job, where I work as a tracking dog handler, is where we track down bears and wolves that have created problems or just want to document where they have been walking in relation to humans, houses, or livestock. And then often you have no or very few chances of seeing the dog. So you cannot really read the dog because the terrain or the darkness will make it quite hard for you to see the dog at many times in the track. And even if it was possible for you to see the dog, most of the times you would not want to do that because you need to keep your eyes open to see if you get a glimpse of the bear or the wolf that you are there to, for example, shoot. Because if you miss this opportunity, it may take 10 kilometers of tracking before you get another chance. And I would say that most, not all, but most tracking dog handlers want their dog to put the nose down in the track when it follows the track and pull hard. So as a tracking dog handler, you follow the dog if it has the nose down in the track and pull, then you follow. If there is a slack on the line or if the dog puts the nose up high and starts searching, then you should stop because that means the dog has some issues or has lost the track. So when we now have a dog that has an expectation to follow the contaminated area that is the track in order to find the articles and be rewarded, we want the dog to convince us. So when I have the tracking line attached to the dog, I won't make the dog a favor if I just follow the dog as soon as I see the dog is putting the nose to the ground and starts sniffing. Especially not now in the very beginning of the tracking training, because still it's mainly or exclusively the handler's own tracks that the dog is following. So I, as a handler, I know exactly where the track goes. And then it's easy for me when I see that the dog is just picking up the track, tracking 1 meter. It's easy for me to follow because I know exactly where the track is. But that's a bad habit to teach the dog, that we are telling it that yes, this is the right track, and follow after just 1 meter of tracking, because that's not what it's going to look like later on when you have no clue where the track is. So it's important already here that you stand still and let the dog pick up the track and convince you that this is where the track goes. So you can put some tension on the line, so the dog has to pull the line out of your hands. And when the dog has its nose down in the track and pulls, then you release line, and after having given 5, 6 or 7 meters of line, if the dog is still in the track, then you start to follow, because that is the habit we want or need later on when it's real tracks where the handler has no clue whatsoever where they are going. So at the start of the track, stand still and only follow the dog once it has convinced you that it is on the track. So picking up tracks often look like this. The dog first walks a couple of meters in the track and it looks like it is actually on the track. But then after a couple of meters more, it turns back and continues searching. If I, as a tracking dog handler, follow the dog already here, I risk pushing the dog forward without the dog having gotten really attached to the track. So stand still, let the dog convince you it has the track. It doesn't matter if the dog has to show you 1, 2, 3, 4 times, because later on you will need the dog to have the habit of having to show you and convince you that yes, the track is here. And then you need to train like that also here when you know exactly where the track is. So I will try to repeat this many times, because this is one of the issues that we struggle most with tracking dog handlers that we have on courses, to make them stand still at the start and only follow the dog if it has convinced you and you are totally sure that the dog has picked up the track. There is no hurry. Take the time you need. If the dog doesn't manage to convince you, well, then it loses that opportunity to track. And it can get a new chance 5 minutes later with another track. So if you stand still and let 2 or 3 meters of line out and then follow the dog, there may later on be a turn in the track. And if you follow the dog, you risk pushing the dog past the turn, because the dog has not really understood which scent or what track it is it's supposed to follow. It's still just searching for a track. And every step you take then risks getting you further and further away from the actual track. So never follow the dog if you're not totally sure the dog has the track. because chances are you just bring the dog further and further away from the track. So instead, stand still, let the dog search for several meters, and stand still until the dog has got at least 5, 6, or 7 meters of tracking line between you and the dog, and has convinced you by having the nose down in the track and pulling that it is really on the track. Then, and only then, you start following the dog. And this is not only important in the start of the track, especially in the basic training of a tracking dog. It loses the track or gets issues in the track. And then you need to do exactly the same thing. So if the dog stops or the line slacks because the dog is turning around or searching, you should already be stopping as a tracking dog handler, because then you have a high chance of actually standing in the track. And the dog can then search its way closer and closer to you and pick up the track and continue. If the dog doesn't find the track, then you go 1 or 2 steps backwards. You just back where you came from, because that is where the track is. Never go forward if the dog is not convincing you that it has the track, because chances are that there is a dead end or a sharp turn and the dog has missed it. And then every step you take forward will bring you further and further away from the track. So here is an example of a dog following a track, and then as long as the dog is pulling and has the nose on the ground, the handler will follow. But when there's a slack on the line, the handler will stop, and the dog has to convince the handler that it has the track again before following. So stand still at the start, and if there is a slack on the line, stop and stand still until the dog has convinced you that it has the track again by putting the nose down in the track and pulling. And remember that here at these stages, it's you who has been laying the track, so you know exactly where it goes. In order for you to be able to do this, you need to hold the tracking line with both hands. Later on, when the dog is properly trained, it's perfectly fine to hold the line with just one hand. But at this stage of the basic tracking training, I find that it helps a lot if the handler is active with the line handling. So here the dog has some issues in the track. As a dog handler, it may be hard to know if it's because the track makes a sharp turn, if the person has been picked up by a car, or if the dog simply lost the track. And what we want to avoid here is that the dog searches for the track in large circles. It drives me crazy if I have a tracking dog that circles around me searching for the track, because many times the areas are not as open and nice as when we set up the tracking training exercises like in this area. Many times it's a lot of trees or lampposts or cars that the line will then get tangled in. So I prefer creating the habit in the dogs that they turn around their own axis. So if the dog slacks the line and starts searching in circles on its way back towards me, I then actively manage the line by holding it in my left hand and pulling with my right hand, so that when the dog comes closer and closer to me, it will eventually have to circle around its own axis under my left hand. It has no possibility to go in a circle around me and get tangled in a lot of things. And this quickly becomes a habit for the dog to just circle around its own axis where the track is in front of the handler, instead of making these big circles, which are unnecessary and just a habit that we have created by allowing the dog to do that and then picking up the track and following the track and become reinforced. So the dogs don't need to track with that technique. It's just a habit that we can create or we can avoid to create. So then we have a dog that can use the technique we want when it's tracking. And then it's time to start adding turns. And here it is also about creating the habits that we want. And if you start off by doing 90-degree turns, you have a high likelihood of the dog following the track. And when it comes to the 90-degree turn, it walks over the turn, continues maybe 2, 3, 4 meters past the sharp turn, and then is putting its nose up and starts circling to find the outgoing track, and then it picks it up and is reinforced when it finds the article for searching for the track at the other side of the turn. And this quickly becomes a habit. So instead of following the track over the turn, the dog learns that it simply puts the nose up and is searching for the track on the other side of the turn. And in the forest, where not many other people have been walking, that may not be a big problem. But if you're tracking in urban or more populated areas, this increases the risk of the dog switching to another track, because it's leaving the track it's following and then searching for this track, but it may then pick up another track. So in order to reduce that risk, we want the dog to just follow the track through the turns, because that's also a habit that we can teach the dog. But then instead of immediately doing 90-degree turns that the dog will miss, we can do a little bit banana curved tracks, and then we gradually increase the sharpness of the turn. And this way we can teach the dog the habit to just follow the track also when there is a turn in the track's direction. So for example, we can first make a 20-meter long track that turns left and right 45 degrees. And then we gradually go from 45 degrees to 90 degrees and then to 180 degrees. And we start to make the tracks turns sharper and sharper. But to start with, we make the turns banana shaped, very soft turns that may be more like a straight track. But what we want is just to be able to reinforce the dog for tracking with the technique we want, no matter if there is a change of direction in the track or not. And this is no beauty contest. It doesn't have to look like the dog's nose is attached to a rail in the ground. But what is important is that the dog doesn't leave the track and then start searching and pick up the track on the other side of the turn. If that happens, then simply take one step back in the progression and make the track turn a little bit softer, and then you can start increasing the sharpness of the turn again. And if you then run into troubles, decrease the sharpness, because the most important thing is that you can reinforce the dog for following the track with the technique that you want, and that is not to leave the track and start searching for it on the other side of the turn, but just follow the track also when it changes direction. So then it is time to work on surface transitions. And that is to a large extent also a matter of habits and, of course, the dog's expectations. We want the dog to have the expectation in the track and forward. So that means if the track goes up on the road, for example, the dog should not have the expectation to just run to the other side of the road and pick up the track. Because many times, if an animal or a human comes up on the road, they will not just cross it, they will follow the road and walk on the road, because it's usually the quickest way to transport yourself. But if our dogs then have the expectation to just run to the other side and search and pick up the track again, that means we will waste a lot of time and miss a lot of tracks that simply go up on the road and then continue for several hundred meters or kilometers on the road. So what we want the dog to do is to have the expectation just to stay in the track. And then we can go back to the very basic exercises where we had the contaminated areas, the 1 meter boxes on asphalt. So when the track layer, which is still you as a dog handler, when you lay a track that comes out from grass on asphalt, you make a small scented box. And if the dog has problems having a high expectation on asphalt, you may also help it by putting your hands down on the asphalt, just to make it more likely that the dog will sniff intensely on the asphalt. So when the dog comes from the grass onto the asphalt, it finds the scent box and it has the expectation to find articles there. So it's sniffing more intensely and then concludes there are no articles there and continues with the track. And I don't know if you saw when I was setting the track, in the middle of the road, I was putting an article down, but the dog just walked over it, and then it missed the opportunity to be rewarded. The worst thing we can do as handlers here is to stop the dog in order to increase the likelihood it will actually find and indicate the article, or in any other way help the dog, because then that will become a cue for the dog to find and indicate articles, and that's not what we want, because later on, when the handler has no idea where the articles are, he or she will not be given that cue. So just let the dog miss the articles if it does, and it uh, uh, it is its own fault that it missed an opportunity to be rewarded. And then we gradually get rid of the contaminated areas in the surface transitions. I think you get the idea. First, we make a contaminated area on the asphalt, and then we make a smaller contaminated area and smaller until we make no contaminated area at all. If we then run into troubles, then we take one step back and make a contaminated area again. So then we have a dog that can also do surface transitions. And then it's time to start working on blind tracks, or ordinary tracks actually, where someone else than the track layer has been setting the track. But before we talk about that, we'll take a 5-minute break. And please get up and move. And we meet here again at 5:30. So that will be 5 minutes from now. We start again. So, until now, the handler has been walking all or almost all tracks on his or her own. And that is in order to know where the track is, so they can follow the dog when it wants to follow the track with the correct technique. But as soon as possible, we want to start doing blind tracks or ordinary tracks. And there are many ways to do this. One more systematic way that I like, because it makes it easy, is to first have the handler self-deciding how long the track should be. And as a rule of thumb, the track should be a length that the handler is confident the dog will 9 times out of 10 have no problems following. So let's say, for example, that I think that my dog can do a 30-meter long track. Then I have another person setting a 30-meter long track for me with 10 articles in the track. So the person is leaving 10 articles that this person has been touching, so it has her or his scent on them. And when I can do a 30-meter long track with 10 articles 3 times in a row, then I move on. And the articles are there mainly to help the handler, but also to reinforce or assure the dog that it is okay to follow this track. So with 10 articles in a 30-meter long track, it will mean the dog has a new article every 3 meters. So it will not have to go very far before being reinforced again. After 3 successful 30-meter tracks in a row, I move on to the next step, and that is a twice as long track. So with a 30-meter long track from the start, that would mean a 60-meter long track, still with 10 articles. When I can do that without having any clue apart from where it starts, I move on to step 3, and that would be a 60-meter long track with 5 articles in it. So we keep the length, but we decrease the number of articles. So then the dog will have to follow the track for a few more steps before being reinforced. And then step 4 is to make the track once again twice as long. So that would then mean 120 meters in this case with 5 articles. And then we make the track twice as long again, and that would mean 240 meters and 5 articles. And then step 6, it would be a track that is almost 500 meters long and 5 articles. If we run into problems, we take one step back in this progression and do a track that is half as long, or if we go back to step 2, it also has twice as many articles. Just mark the start and also the end, and especially when the tracks start to get longer, it's not sure that the dog team comes to the end, so I prefer just tying a knot with toilet paper at the end. Then it's not a big deal if the track, the dog team doesn't find the end. We can just leave it there and it will rain down to the ground and disappear quite quickly. When you train for blind tracks, which I would say all tracking dog teams do, because a blind track is an ordinary track. It will be much more common later on that you follow tracks that you have no clue where they are going, compared to that you follow tracks that you already know where they are going. But in order to do this, it is crucial that the dog has expectations on articles in the track, because that will be the easiest way to reinforce the dog in a blind track. Since the handler has no idea where the track is going, it's quite risky for the handler to start reinforcing the dog for tracking with a nice technique when the dog may actually have switched over to another person's or another animal's track. If we have a dog that has the expectation to find these articles in the track or in the contaminated area, that will also make it easier, because then it will be this expectation that pulls the dog forward in the track. And as a handler, you just need to stand still at the start, let the dog get some line before you continue. I will show you an example of a friend of mine doing a track that is blind to him. It's me who laid the track. And to start with, everything goes just fine. This is a quite intense Sprocker Spaniel. And here I went down from the grass onto the asphalt, but I just walked one step out on the asphalt before turning 90 degrees to the left and walking along the grass here. But since he doesn't know that, and he is not standing still, he will push the dog further and further away from the track. So remember that the track goes one step out on the asphalt and then 90 degrees to the left, following the grass. So here the dog is searching for the track. So here it's important that the handler stands still, and if the dog picks up or looks as if it is picking up the track, still stand still, let line out of your hands until the dog has convinced you it is in the track. Then you move. But here you can see he doesn't. He's just walking, following the dog, although there has been a slack on the line and the dog is clearly searching for the track. And now he is also past the track. So every step he takes now will bring both him and the dog further and further away from the track. And the dog will have a very small chance of picking it up. see the dog is still searching and he is just moving forward. And the problem is that it's not only my friend here doing this. This is one of the most common issues for all tracking dog handlers. Instead, what he should have been doing is here, standing completely still until the dog has convinced him it has the track. Not follow along as the dog is searching for the track. This is extremely important and something you need to do in the basic training when you know where the track is, because otherwise it will be a too big step to start working on your technique and tracks that you have no clue where they are at the same time. When we have started doing blind tracks, we need to work on the pickup and how to determine the direction of the track. And this could be a webinar on its own, because this is difficult. Dogs for sure can follow tracks from birth, but they have no clue which direction is the one direction that will pay off. For wolves, for example, they just as often get reinforced if they follow the track of moose or deer backwards as forward. Because if they follow moose tracks backward, it will lead to a pine stand where there are other mooses grazing that they can hunt. If they follow a moose track forward, it will lead to a pine stand where there are mooses standing and grazing. So there is nothing in the dog's genetics that tells it that it should follow tracks forward. That is something we need to train the dog to do. Otherwise, it will be like throwing a dice when the dog picks up a track, if it goes backward or forward. And we can do this by, until now, always having started the dog in the track with the dog's nose in the direction of the track. So that way we can hope to create the habit of tracking means following a track forward. And the dog has never really even had the chance to follow a track backwards. And then at this point in the training, we start off by presenting the track to the dog in an increasingly difficult angle. So from having the dog sitting or standing in the track with the nose facing in the direction of the track, we have the dog sitting or standing just by the track with the nose in a 45-degree direction of the track. And if that works, it follows the track to the next article, indicates, is rewarded. Then we take the dog off the track, walk 2 or 3 meters in the track, and then put the dog by the track, but in a 60 or 70 degrees angle. And then we do the same thing and put the dog in a 90 degrees angle, and then slightly in the opposite direction of the track. And this can be done on the same track. So we can set the track that is maybe 500 meters long, and then rapidly increase the angle that the dog has to pick up and determine the direction of the track, because it will have a general idea of which direction this particular track is going in. That means we can very quickly change the angle in which the dog picks up the track. And then we do the same thing the next session and the next session. And after a while, the dog starts to understand that it doesn't matter in which angle in relation to the track the dog finds the track, it should follow it forward. Should the dog, for example, here when we start presenting the track at a 90 degrees angle, should the dog then, for any strange reason, pick up the track and try to follow it backwards, let it follow the track backwards the length of a leash, so approximately 2 meters, and then stop it. You don't need to say anything, just stop it so it learns that this is the consequence. And then it will turn and take the track in the forward direction, and then you release the line out of your hands. And the dog is allowed to follow the track and find the next article and be reinforced. So if we have a look at the video of this, it can look something like this. And in the last stages, the dog is positioned so its nose is pointing 180 degrees in the wrong direction of the track. So it is sitting with its nose pointing backwards in the track. And as always, if the dog runs into trouble, which it will, then you just take 1 or 2 steps back in the progression, make the angle easier for the dog in relation to the track, and continue from there and make the angle gradually harder. If the dog has problem, make the angle a bit easier. So try to have progression, but if the dog struggles and you cannot get 3 successful repetitions in a row, then instead of just banging your head, take a step back, make the exercise a little bit easier for the dog so you get a chance to reward it for the correct behavior. And when it comes to searching for tracks, this is maybe the hardest part of the tracking. And we can then do it in exactly the same way as I just showed, but we start from a kinder angle, maybe 45 degrees, and we start 2, 3, 5 meters away from the track. So the dog has to search for the track for a few meters before encountering it and picking it up in the correct direction. And then gradually make the angle harder and harder from 5 meters until the dog can pick it up also when entering the track close to 180 degrees in the wrong direction. And then increase the distance the dog has to search to 10 meters and then 15 and then 20 until you reach the distance you need to search. And for example, the dogs we use to search for tracks from bears and wolves, they often have to do searches for tracks for several kilometers. And then you can only depend on having created a high expectation in the dog, because if the dog is then taking 1 or 2 steps without having a high sniffing frequency, it will risk missing the track. And you can have a progression for this as well when you start doing this blindly, where you, for example, have a 100-meter long track to start with, 5 articles in the track, and the track passing, for example, 2 trees or 2 bikes or 2 other objects on the ground, so that the dog handler knows that between these 2 objects the track has passed, and the dog handler also gets to know that it first passed this object and then the other one. So then the dog handler can pick up the track between these objects and follow it and reward the dog when it finds articles. The next step is to do exactly the same thing, but the dog handler gets no information about the direction of the track. So the dog handler will not know if the track went from left to right or right to left. And when the dog handler can do that successfully 3 times in a row, we move to a 100-meter long track, 5 articles in the track, and 1 point as a start. So the dog handler gets to know that the track passes this tree or this lamp post. So they get 1 spot where they can search for and pick up the track, but they have no idea about the direction. And then in step 4, we make it a bit harder by saying that the track has passed within 10 meters from a certain tree or a lamppost or a car. So then the dog handler knows the general area where to search for the track, but not exactly where the track is, and does not know what direction the track is going in. So this is one example of a progression for doing that kind of training. And then we have a dog that knows the basic skills. It can track with the technique the dog handler wants. It can take turns, surface transitions. The dog handler knows how to manage the line and knows to stand still, so that they can actually manage also ordinary blind tracks. And the dog knows how to pick up and determine the correct direction. And now the really fun tracking dog training starts, because now it's up to you to challenge the dog, to make it understand that it doesn't matter what the context is. Its job is still to follow the contaminated area, that is the track, and indicate the articles in it. And this is the flow channel. I have stolen it from a book on human resource management, but I think it depicts very well also, or it illustrates dog training. So if we here have a dog that knows how to do blind tracks in rural environments, and we train that, then the dog will get more and more skilled. But if we don't make the tracks more and more challenging, the dog will be out here to the right of the flow channel, and the tasks will be so easy, so the dog is bored. It doesn't have to focus and pay attention to complete the tasks. And then we, as trainers or handlers, lose control over what we reinforce. If we, on the other hand, increase the level of the challenge too quick before the dog has acquired some skills, the dog will have no clue what to do, and it will experience anxiety. So we need to stay in the flow channel. As the dog gets a little bit more skilled, we need to increase the challenge. Then the dog gets more skilled and we increase the challenge. And this also illustrates quite well why it's not possible to train a dog to a certain level and then just do maintenance training to keep it at this level, because then we will end up here in boredom. So throughout the dog's whole life, we need to increase the level of the challenge. And this is, I think, extremely fun. So when you go by car and you realize that you're driving through a roundabout and you realize that you have never been tracking a track that goes in a roundabout, well, then that's a perfect reason to do that. And the same goes for tracking indoors. So even if your dog will rarely be used for tracking indoors, it's good to try to vary the locations. Not try. You should not try to always be tracking in the kind of environment where you will be working, because chances are you and the dogs view the world a bit different. So just try to vary as much as possible in order to give the dog a chance to generalize that it is the same thing that the dog is expected to do wherever you are. And then at the end, two things. So if you have a biting dog, that should be able to track and bite or attack people in the track, like for example in this training session. do that very rarely, because this is a high value reinforcement for the dog, and you risk creating a high expectation to the end of the track if you do this several times a month. So try instead to have the rewards in the track in the shape of small articles, so the dog has an expectation in the track. Then you will more often also get to the end of the track. But if you create a high expectation to the end of the track, it's very likely that the dog will lose the track because it has the expectation over there instead of down here. And this also goes for search and rescue dogs or tracking dogs, where you use decoys that the dog should not bite but just bark or indicate. That's also a very valuable reinforcement for the dog. So if you have that, try to not have it several times per month. And when you do, make sure the track continues afterwards. So the dog is not expecting that the decoy means also the end of the track, but that you create the expectation to continue the track afterwards. And finally, be aware of other dog people like yourselves, because we always lay tracks that are too easy compared to ordinary people. Ordinary people, especially the ones who are trying to get away from you, they have no clue. Often they are not known in the area. And if they are not known to the area, they may have a hard time to decide which way to go. So they often walk, stop, walk in circles, thinking about which way to go, and then walk back, and then change their mind and come back again. So it's very messy tracks most of the time. And if you train with ordinary or with dog people setting the tracks for you, you will get a dog that is used to too easy dogs or too easy tracks for the dog to be able to manage ordinary people's tracks. So be prepared that it will look like this. It will not look like if your dog is attached to a small string to a rail in the road, because it's only dog people who set tracks like that. No ordinary person walks in that manner. And a category of people that are extraordinary track layers are children, because many times they have no experience in training tracking dogs. So they don't really know what is an easy or a difficult track. The worst track layers are your colleagues or dog training friends. They will always make far too easy tracks when they set tracks for you. So one thing I have been successful in is to give children a €5 note and tell them that if I find them, I will get the money back. If I don't find them, they will get to keep the money. And if you can also give them a GPS receiver, that helps a lot, because later on you are then able to see where you lost the track and what track the track actually took, or if you get to the person in the track, you will see where you may have been lucky and the dog found the track again after having lost it, or you will be able to see that you follow the track perfectly well, although the child had been walking like a crazy person, which is basically what they are, because they are normal and not dog nerds like us. So then they act in a completely different manner, and they don't walk straight lines. They walk back and forth and in circles, and they do all kinds of crazy things that an ordinary adult dog training person would never come to think of. Okay, that's it. Then we go through the questions. So Katrin writes about motivation. What is your experience and differences when working with hounds, like bloodhounds, Bavarian or Hannoverian, instead of shepherds, retrievers, spaniels? So we have had quite a few of the floppy ear hounds when in the programs where we track wolves and bears, for example. And my experience is that these breeds of dogs are often very difficult to train, because it is difficult to motivate them with toys or play. And that means that a day when the dog is motivated to track, they track perfect. Then they are really nice. But then the next day, it may not feel like it. And then I have no tool to motivate it to do this. And this is an issue with working dogs, because they need to be motivated every day, 365 days a year, and do the work. And then it's much easier with shepherds, retrievers, or spaniels that are crazy for toys and playing and easy to motivate. But there has been some Bavarians and Hanoverian dogs and that kind of dogs that has been possible to motivate and has been performing fairly well. When it comes to bloodhounds, I must say I don't think I have ever seen a bloodhound that works reliably, simply because the handler has no motivation that will make the dog work reliably every day. But sometimes when they feel like it, they can do well. But for working roles, for police or search and rescue, I have never seen a bloodhound working in a way that is okay. Meike writes, are the first tracks up to 50 meters always those of the dog handler? Yes, I prefer getting the basic techniques, the turns and surface transitions working well on the tracks of the dog handler so that we know exactly where the track is. Sylvia writes, can you repeat please why if the scent is on the grass the dog walks in the center of the road? So I think that refers to the very start of this presentation where there was a dog. I think I will bring up that video again. It makes it easier to explain. So in this video, there is a person that has been walking in the middle of this small path. And the person has been walking in the middle of this street. So here is contamination from the person's shoes, but there is always also some flakes of skin and hair and other things dropping off from the person walking. And the wind will take these and they are most likely to get stuck here in the gravel or in the grass. And it's possible to train the dog to follow these traces of scent particles. But it's also perfectly possible to make the dog follow the track from the contamination on the ground. And usually that is what is called a tracking dog, and an air scenting or trailing dog is a dog that more loosely hovers or searches its way in the track by using the airborne scent and the particles that are also many meters away from the track. So the reason for why the dog follows the contaminated area on the asphalt, although there may actually be a stronger scent in the grass or in the gravel, is because it has been trained in the initial stages to expect to find the small articles in the contaminated area, not on the side of the track where the small particles are, but in the contaminated area by the feet. I hope that made sense. Sheila writes, during basic training, would you pay attention not to change the type of shoes too often between training sessions? No, actually, I would prefer doing the opposite, because it is for sure some shoes that are more easy for the dogs to follow the tracks of, and others are more difficult. And in general, older shoes have more scent than newer shoes. But already from the start, there is enough scent also when you walk with new shoes, because there will be some skin flakes and hair dropped also close to your footsteps. So I would prefer changing shoes relatively often. It only makes it easier for the dog to generalize that I'm following the track of this person, the handler, rather than having the dog following the scent from a special pair of shoes, because then they would probably follow those shoes also if someone else took them on. And Sheila also writes, when doing 100 to 200 meter tracks with turns and surface transition, how often is it acceptable not to be able to reach the end of the track? So in the beginning of the training, it's perfectly normal that you don't reach the end of the track. But after some weeks of training, you should be able to reach the end of the track at least 9 times out of 10 if the track is still there. But if you, for example, set the track inside the city center where a lot of cars are driving over it and persons are walking over it, then the molecules of scent from you, from the track layer, will be removed after just 20 or 30 minutes. It's not that the track has aged, it's just that the mechanical wearing has removed track. So there is no track anymore for the dog to follow. And then, of course, you cannot expect the dog to follow it. But if there is still a track on the ground, if you're in a rural area or in an IKEA parking lot a Sunday morning, then you should expect at least 9 times out of 10 to reach the end. Silja writes, how do you tell a dog who search by smell? Well, this is interesting. If you can do scent articles. So if I, for example, get lost in the city center of Örebro, which is a fairly big city here in Sweden, and you get one of my gloves from the car and have the dog sniffing the glove, and then it should find the track of me and pick that track up. So theoretically, this is possible. We know that because there are competitions like the KNPV scent discrimination competitions where the dog should sniff a iron bar that someone has been holding, and then it should search 6 similar iron bars, out of which 1 has been held by the same person and the other 5 has been held by someone else. And the dog should then sniff 1 iron bar and go and grab the iron bar that has been held by the same person. And that is a very tricky task for the dog, and they often do wrong. But if we expect the dog to do that, but not search for the same article or the same type of article that has also been held in a hand, but it should match the smell from my glove with the smell from my footsteps on the ground. And it may have to search for much longer than just the 3 or 4 meters it has to search in a scent discrimination competition. Then I would say that in practice, we cannot really often expect the dogs to be able to match the correct track with the scent sample. So in theory, it is possible, and sometimes I'm sure it happens, but I have not seen any example of this being reliably used, where the dog actually matches the scent of the article with the scent of the track layer. Many times it seems that the scent article that is given to the dog is more the cue to start searching for a track, and the dog will pick up the closest track or the type of track that it is used to follow. But it would be interesting to do more trials and some research on this. Christina writes, for how long do the track age in the beginning and in the progression plan? So in the beginning, the tracks are completely fresh. I should have said that. So I just walk the track and then go back, pick up the dog. So the track may be 5 or 10 minutes old. And that means there is a lot of scent in the air around the track, and there's a lot of scent on the track. And that way we can teach the dog that what pays off is the track, the ground-borne scent, not all the airborne scent. If we set the track that is aged for 1 or 2 hours, then much of the airborne scent is gone, which will make it easier for the dog to stay in the track on the ground, but it will not get the chance to discriminate away this scent cloud. So I prefer setting the tracks and having them completely fresh when I start. But if you want a nice track for your Facebook, a nice video for your Facebook, you should take a track that is between 1 and 2 hours old, because then most of the airborne scent is gone. So you will get the track where the dog has the nose very close to the ground and is sniffing nicely and not going too much to the sides. So it will look better. So these tracks are generally the most easy ones. So age in itself is not a big problem. It is the mechanical wearing in very crowded areas that simply removes the track, and that may take 15 minutes in a very crowded city like Amsterdam or any other European big city. So it's not realistic to follow tracks in that environment that are several hours old, because the tracks no longer exist. Sorry for going over time, but thank you very much for your attention and your questions. I hope you have a nice evening. See you at another time. Bye.